Good morning, everyone. We'd like to welcome you on behalf of ARM to the virtual meeting on the Mesa. This is our discussion on lessons learned from, vanguard of cell and gene therapies. I'm Eric Faulkner. I'm a vice president at Evidera. I lead our precision and transformative medicine initiatives for the business and run a center of excellence focusing in that area. It's my pleasure today to be hosting and moderating through this discussion with three of the real, leading organizations in the field. All of these three have focused on rare disease products. And I'll do quick introductions and then I'll do a bit of setup before we jump into the questions. And I'll start with Shannon first.
Hello, good morning, everyone. I'm Shannon Baumann. I work at Bluebird Bio in our market access function, which we call Access Value and Evidence Strategy. I lead our market access organization for our severe genetic disease or rare disease franchise. And happy to be here today.
Thank you. Sarah?
Hi, I'm Sarah Pitlock. I'm the head of global pricing and reimbursement at Spark Therapeutics, which, as many of you know, is a fully integrated gene therapy company, and we're now a member of the Roche Group. I'm in charge of all of our pricing and reimbursement strategy work, and so I price Luxturna, which is the first U.S. Food and Drug Administration approved gene therapy for genetic disease, and we are working on alternative payment policies to help timely access for patient therapy. Prior to that, I was at Alexion doing work in the rare disease space, and prior to that, I was at Genentech.
Awesome, thank you. And then last but not least, Tay.
Hi, everybody. Tay Salimullah, the head of global pricing, access, and integrated evidence at Avexis, now been renamed as Novartis Gene Therapies. And we are responsible within our function for an integrated effort all the way from looking at translational access to pricing for gene therapies. Thirdly, looking at how we can elevate the area of HEOR to gene economics. And fourthly, how do we integrate real world data to support the ongoing value proposition of these products. So delighted to participate in this ARM discussion with my fellow colleagues and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. It's been a busy couple of years, for these companies and others really that have kind of stepped out on the proverbial moon of launching the first cell and gene therapies in the world at this point, other than some of the prior ones that may not have been considered to be transformative. But I just want to take a pause and initially just kind of get some of your thoughts and reactions about what it's been like to go through this launch period, what's important. We see tremendous opportunity. These are transformative therapies. Some of them may actually have the potential to cure a disease. They provide opportunities to help patients beyond much of what we think about when we conceptualize expectations around therapies. So I'd just like to, start off by just gaining some thoughts from you on what the experience or your perspective has been like these first couple of years going into the world with your therapies. And Shannon, we'll start with you.
Sure. Well, first of all, I think everyone involved in this space is very excited to be part of this new frontier of medicine, and it over the last several years, and it continues to be an exciting space with trying new things, kind of throwing out the old pharma launch playbooks and seeing, taking a new approach to everything we do when it comes to commercializing these types of therapies, and really thinking about why should we approach it this way or that way, or what needs to be different for these types of therapies, and what is okay to stay the same. So I think it's taken a lot of really creative brainstorming, which has been really exciting to be a part of, and a lot of risk taking and sort of just generating ideas and putting them out there into the marketplace and see what happens, and really try to encourage a lot of multi-stakeholder conversations, because these are important therapies and we do need to get them to patients, and it is going to take a lot of creative thinking and new approaches to get them there.
Yeah, and I think that's such a critical point of not assuming that yesterday's rule book works for these types of therapies. Across many of the decision dimensions, it's critical to ask yourself as an organization, is that, if we think that's the conventional strategy, is that really going to work here? Across many dimensions, evidence generation, flow through of the logistics and supply chain, all of these therapies. Out of 25 years of working in the space, I have yet to see a therapy in the space that was born to enter the reimbursement system and the payment system that these therapies are entering. But Sarah, I'll take some thoughts from you as well.
Sure, and I think I have to add, at least my legal team will want me to add, that these opinions are my own and not necessarily reflective of those from Spark. But with that said, our motto at Spark, or one of our mottos at Spark, is that we don't follow footsteps, we create the path. And I think really we showed that launching the first FDA-approved gene therapy in the US. Not only did we feel just a moral and professional and personal responsibility and obligation to make sure that we priced our drug appropriately, but that we had access for patients who needed the first gene therapy in the US. So we took it as not a role only for Spark, but also for the industry as a whole, to make sure that we didn't mess it up, and to make sure that we got compliments from payers who said, you priced responsibly, you did take into consideration the overall aspects of the US system. I think we've learned a ton from our launch and our experience. Things that we didn't think were challenges became challenges. Things that we thought would be easy became more difficult. Launching a cellular gene therapy, or a product that's intended for one-time use, particularly in the US system, is hugely, hugely challenging because of the way the system is set up. Our CEO used to say this, and it was a great saying as well, that said that we are launching Jetson type medicine and a Flintstone type reimbursement system, and being able to think differently, not throw away the playbook, as Shannon said, was incredibly important. But we also made sure from the Spark perspective that we didn't just set a price, give it to payers, shove it down people's throats and walk away and say, tough, just deal with the patient access. We set up a really comprehensive system. We follow patients through the system. We worry about travel. We worry about all sorts of logistics that are unique to the cell and gene therapy space. And we think thus far, 3 years later, it's been a huge success, but we know that we have a long way to go. And a lot of that does depend on the system and changing the system. It's been rewarding and great to see these patients get treated, but if we don't make some big changes just as an industry in the overall healthcare environment, it's going to be limited for patients getting access to these treatments. So we know that we have a long way to go as well.
Yeah, and the single administration issue is profoundly different, particularly based on how the systems emerge to pay for things. So all of the models that have been discussed in the industry, payment over time, even in scenarios where the payers and other stakeholders have an interest or would adopt them, there may be legal or policy or other issues that are much more complicated that they have to work through on their end, just as much to be able to figure out how to chart their own path, for their side of how to ensure that patients have access to these therapies. So we've definitely had those discussions with the ARM NAMCP payers, even in social systems, like some of the European systems. It's a cash flow issue at the facility level. For if you have a one-time payment, it's just a challenge. There's no system in the world that's set up to have that easily occur, but then it's complicated because the system also at the same time may not be set up to have the flexibility to evolve when new, really transformative or disruptive therapies enter that change our expectations, what we think about, not only what to expect for the value of therapies, but how to even flow them through systems.
Right.
Tay, would love to have some of your thoughts as well about these initial experiences.
Eric, hi, yeah. So in an industry like ours, I have to say it's so difficult to develop even one medicine and achieve broad access. And I think this this session that you're organizing, Eric, it's actually very timely because I think it's a moment for my colleagues, myself, to pause and reflect on the incredible amount of work organizations are doing to really, elevate cell and gene therapies and bend the curve of life for patients and their families. And I think this is to be really underscored and not to be understated, because it comes with a huge amount of responsibility that patients, families around the world are counting on us, otherwise where there would be no more hope. And I think that's what drives our purpose every day when we get up and we think, how do we go and navigate some of the challenges we're going to talk about? Very much building on the Flintstones analogy, I would say that we're dealing very much with the reality of a 21st century medicine and interventions in 20th century designed healthcare systems. And that's the reality we're dealing with. And, it's turning the model of development, commercialization, and access upside down. However, I would say at this stage, we're very proud as well to say, with the incredible traction we've had with in the space of SMA, we've treated almost to date 600 plus patients, impacting families all around the world, with about 99% final approval rate from on-label patients in the US, which serves as a tremendous example for the industry. And also we now have policies in place with 86% of Medicaid patients as well. I think to also say, how do we think about success in the US and then globally ensuring that we get access and uptake? We've also been grappling with the time lag where patients' lives in Europe, Canada, Japan, all around the world are also important. And how do you sort of reset and look at, new access and early access agreements, post to formal pricing and reimbursement proposals for countries prior to, I would say, approval, even in Europe. And we've had some success there, which we can talk about. I think what I've learned in this space is that our comfort and vulnerability to fail fast while remaining curious and purposeful to keep going and inspiring our teams and our organizations that, this is a new frontier and we'll figure it out. But we have to be very comfortable with trying, some of my colleagues said, learning, failing fast, getting up, being bruised, and getting on with it, because there's a huge amount of responsibility on our organization and my colleagues' organizations to get this right for the industry.
Thank you. It reminds me of the poem, don't go gently into that good night. It's anything worth doing when you're really moving the needle. There always will be moments of uncomfort, but when you really see how it impacts patients, it makes a huge difference. I had a similar experience long ago with the launch of the second enzyme replacement therapy, where we went with the families to a baseball game, which wouldn't have been possible for them without the enzyme replacement therapy that they had access to. Understanding that the world wasn't necessarily built and everything's not tied up in a bow for cell and gene therapies. They're entering a world, despite their transformative potential, where there's a lot of variability in how they're handled, the understanding of them, etc. Would just like to ask from your experiences if you have any insights into some of the great, the biggest challenges, things that may have been unexpected, going in, knowing everything that because you all have a strong value demonstration and access background. Everything that it's like back to Shannon's thought about the rule book doesn't apply. Are there any examples that you can give of something that was like, wow, that's an aha moment for what you should expect if you're developing therapies that are in this transformative category? Shannon, do you want to go first? You're on mute. Thank you.
Sure. So I think I'll start off with greatest challenge. I think for me and Bluebird, I think our greatest challenge to date has probably been extending payers and HTA organizations sort of value horizon in terms of time.
Yeah.
There's a tendency to, from a budgetary perspective, just to think about 1 year increments, maybe 3 years if they're stretching. And from a data standpoint, to really focus on what you have proven in the trials which got you approved. And we've been really trying hard to explain our science being stem cell based, and that vision that all the scientists and developers had to bring these therapies to market. They had a very long-term view about what those cells could do for these diseases. And we're trying to translate that long-term view into the payer space, and it's difficult. The science isn't totally digestible yet, because we are in a new space, and it is complicated science as well. I think there is a bit of a tendency also to lump cell and gene therapies all together, when in fact there are different modalities in the way each of the different modalities treat diseases. So I think the longer term horizon and sort of giving manufacturers the benefit of the doubt, given the relatively short term amount of data that is available at launch, has been a big challenge.
Yeah.
I think one of the surprises we've encountered is some payers and HTA organizations are digging into some of the details in the science and the manufacturing. I can remember in past lives making comments to colleagues that payers don't really care about mechanism of action. They just care about what the data shows at the end of the day. And I think in this case, some are digging into that, particularly in our situation where we have patient-specific manufacturing for each drug product. They are seeking to understand that space and understand how that impacts the data that has been shown in the studies.
Yeah, I think that, my experience interacting with payers is, if you're writing your value dossier, don't take for granted that they understand, the different platforms that are out there, a gene therapy, cell therapy, AAV, lentiviral, gene modified cell therapy, different kinds of cells and what their characteristics are. We're still, even years later, kind of at the tip of the iceberg in terms of understanding how you modify promoter regions, what it means for expectations. I think we're still barely scratching the surface. And then at the same time, these therapies have really pushed the envelope in terms of our thinking that evidence development is a journey, not a destination, especially with these therapies. You're in it for the long haul, and making decisions about where to snap the chalk lines for your initial, launchable package versus how you then follow that data longer term through your registry isn't easy. Many of these therapies are fast track too. So you have the option of fast track is great from a regulatory standpoint, but from a payer standpoint, it may mean that you're struggling, sometimes to put all those pieces together in an even more contracted timeline. So I think that those are both great points. Sarah, I would like to hear some thoughts from you as well.
Sure. I think I could build on a lot of what Shannon said. Being first for Spark and Luxturna, we faced a number of challenges when launching the product. Not only was it the first FDA-approved gene therapy for genetic disease, but it also involved a limited number of patients. Since it was approved to treat an ultra-rare disease, it was an inherited retinal disease due to mutations in both copies of the RPE65 gene in patients who had sufficient viable retinal cells. I mean, that's a pretty limited patient population. And I came from an ultra rare disease company, and then this is ultra rare. So really finding the patients and knowing that applies to a limited number of patients is a challenge. And for other manufacturers, that means you really have to look at each disease state you're going into from a gene and cell therapy space to understand the patient population and how many patients are likely to be there and how you can identify them. Just because someone has a genetic disease doesn't mean that they're easy to identify, because they have to seek care, they have to seek treatment, you have to know where to identify those patients. So in addition to Luxturna having a limited number of patients, It also was going to be limited and administered in a limited number of treatment centers by a limited number of physicians. So we have retinal specialists to administer the product, but we have 10 treatment centers throughout the US where the product is administered. So that means that patients have to travel to certain treatment centers. There's not a treatment center in every state. That was unique to a product like Luxturna and may be different for another gene or cell therapy product. From an evidence perspective, and this is the point that Shannon raised, we had a limited amount of durability data at launch. That's just the fact. We had 3 years at the time of FDA approval for our phase 3 clinical trial. In our phase 1/2, we had more data, but we needed to then set a one-time price for a therapy meant to be administered only once in a patient's entire lifetime. It was the first time in the US that that occurred from a gene therapy perspective. And also the unique aspect of having limited durability of data at launch was not a challenge only for Luxturna. It's coming up over and over again, as Shannon mentioned, for these potentially one-time therapies at launch. So another characteristic of Luxturna that was a challenge and that was unique is that it's for a form of progressive blindness. And from a health economic perspective, when you take that to health technology agencies, it becomes a real challenge because there are a limited number of direct medical costs, which means that costs related to hospitalizations and drug costs associated with vision disorders are really, really low. So patients who have vision disorders weren't having, in particularly RPE65 genetic mutations, they didn't have any other treatments available to them. So when you are doing HTA analyses or doing health economic analyses with a form of progressive blindness from this health economic perspective, you don't have direct medical costs. So we said, oh, what can we do? We really had to look at the indirect medical costs because they can be really significant associated with blindness. So the caregiver cost alone that we looked at for vision impairment for patients that have RPE65 disease was well over $1 million over the course of a patient's lifetime. Well, in the traditional economic modeling approach, in the base case analysis, these indirect costs weren't taken into account. I know this may seem in the weeds details, but this is something that we had to figure out. This is a big challenge for our product, not only being first, not only having small number of patients, not only having small number of treatment centers and physicians. We then had limited data and we had a lot of really high indirect cost data, but very little on the direct cost side. So trying to do the economic modeling and valuing a product like that using traditional health economics means was really, really challenging.
And I think that one important takeaway there is when you think rare diseases are different. You've got some that have very acute, like a neonatal fatal disease where patients may only live with one disease for 6 to 8 weeks versus something where the patient may live for 30 to 40 years. But either there is no treatment. I worked on glycogen storage disease 1A, for which the treatment is eating a bowl of cornstarch every day. Well, cornstarch, even medical grade, is not very expensive. So how do you deal with an economic case for a scenario like that? Some diseases may have limited signs or symptoms. So how do you then measure that the therapy is working? Is it an expression levels? It's something, how do you link the surrogates to the downstream things that may not happen for a decade or more down the line? All of those things are challenging for rare disease, period, but compounded when you're talking about a transformative therapy. Is there, Sarah, is there any sort of takeaway on, is there any time it's too early to start thinking about the access issues? I would say probably not, but
right. Well, of course, that's job security for us, right? To say, no, you got to think of access issues early on. I think that one of the lessons that we learned at Spark is that we did need to start earlier. You need to start your economic modeling earlier, but even in your phase 1, 2, or phase 3, for sure, clinical trials, you need to make sure that you have that value and access component incorporated. And that's a challenge both internally, where you have to tell your internal teams from your R&D clinical side to say, to stand up and wave their hands and say, pay attention to patient-reported outcomes, pay attention to messages from your clinical trial data gathering perspective that you can use in your value messaging, because if you don't do it early, and remember what Shannon and I both said, and Tay as well, like you have to have that durability data. So the longer you can have this information, the better. And so starting early is key. I think there's also the different challenges for, as you said, Eric, a disease that has products for which there are, disease that has products available to treat that disease. Like hemophilia is a good example. There are existing products on the market. They aren't gene and cell therapies yet, but there are existing products on the market to treat that disease. Yeah. Conversely, for Luxturna, there was nothing available. And so that changes your dynamic from a value and market access perspective as well.
Sure. Yeah, hemophilia is a great example of where you do have other alternatives that aren't perfect, but they, are reasonable. So that will be a fascinating dynamic to see how all of that plays out in terms of acceptance potential and how the market access story unfolds. Tay, I'd like to give you a chance to think about some of the challenges you and the team have seen from your perspective, just more broadly, some takeaways.
Yes, so Eric, I'll click into a few of those challenges, and I think just to acknowledge what both Sarah was referencing and yourself, I think the example you shared about hemophilia, although we've had tremendous success in getting this out to patients, both certainly for SMA in the US and Europe, the recent example you shared in hemophilia shows how vulnerable our industry can be as well. And I think you both were mentioning how early, I like to often say it's never too early to plug in access thinking at the translational stage, because number one, the unmet need has to be clarified and a laser-like focus on the clinical value proposition. So do we go a foot wide and an inch deep in an area, i.e. hemophilia, or do we go an inch wide and a foot deep on some few subgroups, get out fast to market to solve an unmet need? I think in this space, the access thinking even becomes even more imperative to start very early. So I just wanted to acknowledge that before I share some challenges and opportunities that we've experienced. So with all of us, with Sarah, Shannon, we're often faced with this, with our colleagues across the organization, this golden triangle of, price, volume, time. And I think what we've learned in this area, Eric, is that those trade-offs and tensions are magnified even more because time is of the essence for these patients who otherwise may not have any more hope, certainly in the space of SMA. And this is firstly challenging the traditional launch sequence. And we have these great kind of backgrounds, or I would say historical analogs of how you do launch sequences for small molecules and biologics. But in an area like ours now, certainly sharing with the group my thoughts now are this is being challenged. Like the Japanese government wanting to come early. We have examples now in Russia, Poland, Czech Republic, prior to EMA approval, after FDA approval, where patient organizations were organizing themselves rapidly with a focus to say, how do I get this therapy fast and make it available? The second thing, Eric, you touched on was that continuous challenge. And I think we have to acknowledge that elephant and say, we are dealing with the reality of incomplete data. And it's disingenuous to promise HTA authorities who are going to continue to throw the rule book or the checklist at us that we're going to meet that. And I think as soon as an industry and from a cross kind of policy perspective, we get our storyboard right there, I think we will go faster together, quicker. As a cell and gene therapies, I would say, organization in different biotechs or for the industry. And I think, Eric, the point you mentioned, this is a continuum of care. Certainly in our case, for SMA, the natural history shows that, it demonstrates that. And we should not assume that our HTM payers understand that. Why should they? Unless we are there to share that understanding. And I think that gives rise again to the point you were making is what's early. How early do you start your natural history of disease, your real world data collection to supplement, regulatory and HTA discussions outside the pivotal program? And I would imagine, not knowing all the details of all the cell and gene therapies, a lot of them are single arm, They are moving from phase 1 to phase 2, dose finding to quickly find to IND registration. And I think I've heard, less than 36 months for some of the CAR therapies that came out from IND to label. And then I think the next question then you have to ask yourself, and certainly for in access, is how are we willing to reset our access brain and relearn and say, how do we align or converge HTA payer thinking with regulatory thinking? And I share an example with you that in the US, public knowledge, we have an age restriction on less than 2 years. And in Europe, we have a positive dilemma where we don't have the age restriction. So benefit risk has been established by the regulator. And it's almost now we have to build the plane and flight at the same time and generate, Eric, what you said, that continuum of evidence generation. But if you're going back to the HTA rulebook, we'll be grappling with that, and we may have some very different conversations. And I think then how do you move beyond that studied population? So in future, this may sound a little provocative, but or deliberate, that the regulatory piece, certainly if you've got the unmet need and the benefit risk established, almost becomes your green light, and then it's the access thinking which is really gonna lead to successful uptake. And at the early stages, if we haven't got that right, then almost we're gonna have, and we have some examples in the past of Evidera and some Condiselect and other products where all the effort then isn't rewarded because you didn't get uptake. So I think we as access people in this space are going to have to come a bit more comfortable with converging that thinking with the regulators early on. We're not there yet, but I think that's a challenge we should take on as an industry together.
Yeah. Early on, even at the translational level, before you pull the trigger on your phase 1, we're seeing some companies that are forward thinking begin to think about natural history, preparing for single arm launch, understanding whether some of that natural history data can also be supplementary to dealing with comparative effectiveness that comes down further down the line. For HTA and payer organizations, we're seeing a lot of companies do integrated scientific advice where they're going to communicate with the regulator and some of the HTA bodies early on to make sure that their game plan seems to be aligned with expectations, their process for collecting outcomes. So I also would agree it's not too early in this space, because as fast as it goes, you don't have a lot of time to recover. We don't always see as many companies think about things like time and motion or their alternate study designs to collect. If you have a more complicated therapy in the space, to collect to understand the episode of care, including to ensure that the provider side, that episode of care cost is accurately put together so that when people do set reimbursement rates and other things that they're informed. You could argue the initial pass by Medicare with CAR T therapies, which now is kind of coming back a couple of years later, underpriced those therapies and actually put patients at risk because the provider side compensation wasn't fully considered. So how to address some of those gaps proactively could be important for these therapies, more so than a lot of other types of therapies. Would like to switch gears a little bit and just take some thoughts from you about preparation for HTA or lessons. I imagine that the HTA part here is super easy and everybody's on the same page. So when the reality is actually the opposite. There's a lot of heterogeneity. We're dealing with therapies that stakeholders are kind of coming up the learning curve around. There are things about what are the expectations for duration data? Is a year, 2 years, 3 years? I mean, what's the expectation? What are the value considerations? What might define a transformative, type of outcome for these therapies that really moves the needle? Any thoughts, from your perspectives, lessons in terms of preparing your overall package, and or how did the HTA bodies respond? What are the kinds of areas that were uncertainties for them that you know you've had to navigate, or the industry is going to have to work harder in the future for this next generation of therapies to navigate, to get to a state where we have a little bit more homogeneity instead of it being all over the place. There's a lot of heterogeneity. You may take the same evidence package and put it in the wood chipper, but the chips always come out slightly differently. But with that lead in, Shannon, I'll let you make some comments and we'll go around the.
Sure. Well, first and foremost, I fully agree that it's never too early to start thinking about what that package that will go into the HTAs looks like. I agree that early advice is something that can be really beneficial. At Bluebird, our head of market access was hired 4 years before our first product approval, so that really gave us a lot of time to prepare and think through what we would need for those dossiers. I think someone mentioned the phrase dose finding in the last round of comments, and at least in our form of gene therapy, the dose finding phase doesn't really exist. And it's not just one parameter. These are very highly technical drug products with lots of different specifications that go into the manufacturing and the drug product development. And it really is sort of a Bayesian approach to clinical development, where we think we have a set of parameters at the time of launch. The regulators have agreed, but it's still, we're still learning about how the product works and how all the different parameters will come together. So I think from a value optimization standpoint, which is what we're all trying to do in these HTA dossiers, we're trying to weave a story together between what the data is we have available at the time of launch and at the time of approval, with the long-term promise of really curing or significantly transforming these diseases. And I think that the reasons to believe in that logic take a lot of time and effort to think through. Some of it is science-based, some of it is database that you'll have to go to the literature or conduct your own real-world evidence studies to complement what you don't have from a single-arm study. And some of it will require clinicians to weigh in and give their expert opinion. So, and a lot of these sort of assumptions and reasons to believe in that long-term value, that long-term durability, really needs a lot of thought, and as much thought as early stage trials. So I think that would be my biggest advice for companies just getting into this space, is to think through how it's not just about the study. When you try to tell the full value story, what are the other pieces of evidence?
Yeah, I think that's especially true on the rare disease side. In terms, again, a lot of these diseases, while they could be archetyped into categories, are different. And from an HTA standpoint, they are sort of the mossy rock in a river of technologies flowing past them. And so you can't take for granted that they understand all the clinical outcomes issues like a KOL that's actually treating patients in the space. They may need that bridge, those conversations with the providers, to even understand some of the potential outcomes issues with the patient population. Sarah, will go to you next for some thought here.
I don't think I've ever been in a webinar or any sort of meeting when someone talked about rivers and mossy rocks, Eric. So I'm really impressed with you. We waved that in from an HTA perspective. That was impressive. We took a bit of a different, a very holistic approach. Again, when we were first in the US, we said, what can we do to really make this launch a success? And we invested a ton of time and effort in understanding how the current constraints of the US healthcare system would impact the price and the access to a one-time treatment like Luxturna. So very specifically, we spent time understanding the concerns of patients and their families. We went to healthcare professionals, we went to treatment centers or provider customers. We talked to payers, the gene therapy investment community, and the health policy community. We even talked to media consultants to figure out how to best relay the message. And we started educating payers really early on about gene therapy under the 21st Century Cures Act. So we tried to tackle it from a very holistic approach. And part of our pricing and reimbursement strategy, like I said earlier, is that we really wanted to offer a menu of options. We just didn't want to simply announce a price and not work with payers and providers to ensure patients had access to therapy. So we had pretty much a three-pronged approach. We created a new pathway for distribution and payment for one-time life-altering gene therapies that we were hoping may serve as a model for other potential gene therapies in the future. And that what we call the Spark Path, that's the patient access to healthcare. And that's the option for payers to purchase Luxturna more directly and avoid intermediaries or associated markups in the process. So we tried to tackle the distribution issue as one for one-time gene therapies. And then we committed to standing by our product from an outcomes-based perspective, and we wanted to share the risk of the price with products to insurers by paying rebates if patients failed to meet a specified threshold. And we did that in both the short and the long term. There were many products that offered outcomes-based agreements before us, and I know we're going to talk about that a little bit more and some of the challenges that we faced with our particular outcomes-based measure because of the disease state and the uniqueness of what our drug treated. But we wanted to ensure and stand by our product both in the short term and in the long term, like up to 30 months after the product was administered. And that was pretty unique from a one-time gene therapy perspective in the US. And then we also felt that we really had to try to make efforts to change the system. Being first, we wanted to set a strategy that hopefully would benefit other products in the future. And so we went to the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services and presented to them a very comprehensive outcome-based demonstration project that would have allowed Spark to offer payers the option to spread payment over time, over multiple years, and that would have provided greater flexibility for even higher outcomes-based rebates. So we really tried to tackle the entire comprehensive system from a reimbursement perspective to ensure that payers and HT agencies just didn't see it as a price alone, but they saw it as a comprehensive set of solutions to ensure that patients had access. We were one of the first gene therapies to go through the ICER review process, and we worked with them very closely. We realized that in the gene therapy space that there wasn't long-term durability data, but there also wasn't a lot of data out there about the disease itself. Again, there were no treatments available, so we were entering the disease without any other products to be compared to. And so there was big data gaps that we went out there and tried to fill. And for giving advice to other manufacturers, attempting to recognize those data gaps and fill them early on would be a very large benefit, because come launch time, you can't create intensive data sets, quality of life data that need to be validated, that need to be published. You need to start doing that much early on. And we included that as part of our comprehensive strategy.
Yeah. And in the movie Jurassic Park, you know, Jeff Goldblum said life will find a way. And I don't really think that that's fully the case with cell and gene therapy. If you versus anything else that most folks have worked on in the life sciences area, because these therapies weren't born to fit into the reimbursement system, you have to think creatively at mapping. You have to understand every step along the way, where might there be a challenge in each of your three organizations, you know, in terms of looking at alternative payment models, comprehensiveness of your evidence package, looking at new metrics and outcomes. Is it safe to say that if you just try to operate in the box without thinking a bit outside, that's probably not the best recipe, that it's okay to have that creativity to think about solving problems, frankly, that the industry's never had to think about solving?
I mean, for sure. I know it sounds so cliche to think, to say to think outside the box, but in our position, you have to. And I can speak a little bit later on about some of the ways that we approached it from an outcomes perspective. I think fundamentally, the issue is that when you're giving a patient a one-time therapy, you can't take it back. And right now, we don't have the technology to redose. We don't have the technology to turn off genes. And so you are giving a patient a product that will change their life forever. But that also, from a payer perspective, you can't stop treatment. You can't cut off treatment. You can't have step therapy with a gene therapy because you can't take it away. You can try other products before that, but that's a totally new way of thinking about treatment paradigm, and from the payer market access reimbursement paradigm as well. And that should factor into the plans from an outcomes perspective for getting a patient to return to the provider. It's very important that you think about those issues differently than for traditional chronic therapies.
And there are very few examples of other types of technologies that have a lifetime effect either. The system wasn't built to reward things that have long-term duration of therapeutic effect or even curing a disease. It just wasn't built that way. The incentive mechanisms never really had to be thought through by any of the stakeholders. But Tay, I'll let you also share some thoughts as well. You know, on the HTA side, and you guys are at you've been out in the market for a while, and you know there may be some thoughts about scalability as you're looking about going through the sequence that you mentioned that may be interesting.
Yeah, no, so just to build on, firstly to reference, I don't want to have the opportunity not to recognize some of the amazing work our teams did in engaging very early with ICER in the US in a very mature way and getting a very, very positive recommendation. I also believe our clinical value proposition for children with this horrendous disease, spinal muscular atrophy, you know, they don't live to see, at least in type 1, their second birthday. So, you know, for our access folks, I think it's imperative, and biotech organizations, when they're selecting their target, whether it's on the AAV platform or an autologous product or a regenerative medicine, that the initial disease state and the target identification has to be having the access voice very early on to model what does a successful outcome look like, such as an ICER type assessment. But Eric, you know, I guess there's the saying of doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a similar result. Is that the saying, or expecting a similar plug and play? And I think what we're learning now is, as pharmacy benefit managers in the US are already predicting potentially 15 billion odd by 2024 in these therapies that will be coming to market, and in also heterogeneous healthcare systems in Europe, who also have huge patient pressure to have access to these available. We're grappling with that, and I think those proactive solutions with engaging with HTAs early is imperative. And it goes back to a previous example I was working on in another life on the CART therapies, where, you know, sometimes we as organizations are also, and I don't mean just in the access, we're stuck in inertia where we don't want to go too early. We may learn something from a HTA body or a regular that may not be in sync with our rule book. And I think that's important, to have the courage to, as a company, align on the key questions you have gaps on, and it's better you find those out early than have a surprise like you just talked about now in hemophilia. And what does that mean? That means, Eric, to your point, that how do we educate or use or leverage regulators and vice versa, HTAs, to have a robust discussion on endpoints, which that all feeds into trial designs, trial length, the stats plan and everything you think of. And I think from our previous experience, we realized in the space of hematology that, you may assume that there's a need for overall survival. You're not powered for that. But having that very open discussion on the unmet need, having patient representatives in the room with HTA bodies in an environment like Europe, from IFA to HAS and then GBA and NICE in the same room, not putting people in a vulnerable state, but not letting them be out on a limb. I think you force a discussion, certainly, where you're only going to have one trial on what is the primary endpoint, what is the secondary endpoints that you need to look for, And that allows you, I think, to then maybe have an open learning mindset that if you end up in a discussion where MRD negative disease is going to be respected, or duration of response or complete response, you honestly may go back and be pleasantly surprised. And I think that gives huge impotence to start these discussions very early on.
Yeah,
that's the first thing. And when you then get into when the rubber hits the road, i.e. the technical, the time it takes to put these dossiers together to accelerate access, you have to be prepared with the reality of getting back, and this is certainly my teams are facing this now, a plethora of, in excess of 30, 50, 75 questions that then you have to react to. And then all the way from one end into the weeds of, is it a lifetime horizon, or is it 20 years or 10 years in those models, to, again, Eric, you touched on, how are you going to pass the red phase test? What registries do you have in place? If I'm going to depart with my, hard-earned taxpayers' money from public systems, how are you going to continue to demonstrate the benefit of this medicine in the real world, which introduces its own reasonable challenges. So I think you've got to be, in summary, prepared for that hard grafting, but also at the same time be very courageous where it's very ambiguous in the early stages. Have those discussions with the regulator and the HTA bodies together, potentially where you can converge on a set of outcomes that may force the organization in a more positive, I would say, trajectory.
Yeah, and payer and HTA groups, whenever you really get into the weeds of those discussions, they may have some sort of preconceived notion about the evidence package or why you should or shouldn't collect some point of data that they really don't understand from a clinical perspective. It's just, hey, this is how they've done everything in the past. And so if you provide rationale and kind of talk it through, well, we can do this, but we can't do that because ... then I think it does open up that dialogue. And there's so many dimensions of uncertainty as we're all learning about these therapies that it's more helpful. It helps de-risk your program. I agree, to really understand the risk is such that you can't take it for granted these days. About half of the integrated scientific advice that's occurring right now is hitting cell and gene therapies because we're coming up a steep global learning curve. And in terms of stakeholder understanding, for the past 3 years, we've had discussions between ARM and the National Association of Managed Care Physicians. And even though the payers are learning more, in the United States, the incentive structures that they're dealing with don't allow them to be proactive in terms of identifying new solutions to help kind of get ahead of things. So in the US, for example, while they may be able to deal with solutions at the individual plan level, getting ahead of some of these things, they're going to wait until they're basically neck deep in cell and gene therapies in some cases. So it's still fluid, even for the other stakeholders that are also coming up the learning curve. And we have, it looks like, about 5 to 10 minutes left, and would like to touch on one more topic. And this is your perspectives on some of the registry data collection. Registries here go beyond safety. You have to have safety follow-up of these patients. Even if for whatever reason your product is no longer on the market, you still have to follow these patients for up to 15 years. But would like to talk to you about just general thoughts and expectations about the registry side. There are 2 dimensions. One is the expectations from the stakeholders across geographies may not be the same, and they're evolving. You've got groups in EMA that are also thinking about what are the expectations for registries. ARM has a registries task force that's been working on this for a time. And the other bit is a registry is not only something just to collect data, it's not static, but it also can be a value demonstration mechanism, beyond launch for your therapy. And any thoughts about about that dynamic? So I'd just like to understand any of your perspectives on that.
I'll start. So yeah, I think a lot of stakeholders are interested in collecting the long-term data associated with our therapies. I think we have a highly cross-functional team that's been involved with our registries for a while now, but you can start early, but at the end of the day, you kind of need the regulatory process to get to the completion before the registry can be finalized. I think one thing we've learned is, while we all hope that one efficient data collection mechanism can serve the needs of all stakeholders, it's actually kind of difficult in practice given where we are today. So I think, for example, the outcomes that we're tying to our proposed risk-sharing payment model can be collected in the registry, but it's only one little piece of data that a very large registry is collecting. And sometimes that data that's relevant to payment models is more efficient to be collected just through claims data that's housed at the payer. Also, a registry for just one product can sort of compete for time from physicians that are entering the data with national disease registries, or with, in our case, with transplant registries. So you end up having 4 potential sources of data that has not complete overlap, but a lot of overlap. And it's really not an efficient approach to track data and get it to the stakeholders who can find it useful. So I do hope going forward that companies are thinking about what's the most efficient way to serve all the needs, and then work externally to kind of whittle it down to one method of data collection that can serve multiple purposes. It's really not efficient.
And the dialogue has been going on for some time now about do we have more of a disease type registry versus the individual registries, and we haven't found a clear landing pad yet, but you know, same sort of discussion in oncology. In oncology maybe a little closer to moving towards you know, that it's a different issue with rare disease where there may be fragmented registries here and there versus oncology too. But I'm sorry.
I was just going to say the one thing I was going to add to that, I wanted to echo everything that Shannon said, but the other point is for a disease-specific registry, for an ultra-rare disease for which there isn't one and there's not enough funding to have that. I mean, a lot of our quote-unquote data that we had from the registry perspective for outcomes purposes, that's being held internally from our patient services team so that we could report it back to payers. It's not a formal registry outside of our safety registry that's going on through the FDA. And so that's a disease-specific issue, which is very different than something like hemophilia that has multiple registries on a global basis. So from a manufacturer's perspective, you really have to look to what disease you're treating and whether there are existing registries versus manufacturer-specific ones that you want to house the data.
Yeah. And Tay, any thoughts from your side?
Yeah, so thanks, Eric. This is a real complex topic with, so I mean, it really is, and we think access is, but this then adds another level of complexity. So I mean, just as a macro perspective, and then I'll share some, you know, more specific examples. I think we mentioned that we're dealing with these, you know, I think Sarah mentioned Star Trek or 21st century medicines, right? Requiring 21st century real world outcomes. And I think, you know, in the complex therapies, I think, and you know, today these were evaluated by measurements used 100 years ago, snapshots of patients and conditions at a specific moment in time. But these 21st century starter medicine require a real world situation to prove sustained efficacy, capturing patients' response on a daily life basis. In our case, more milestones, you know, video diaries, many things that if you think about turning it from an outside in perspective, you're purchasing a big asset and an expensive asset. You want to know over time, what is going to be my return on this asset? And I think this is imperative for us as an industry to own, as an organization to own this responsibility of the aftercare and make sure when a decision commercially has been made to buy an asset, in our case, the cell and gene therapy or regenerative medicine, what is our commitment to make sure in a 20th century healthcare system we continue to demonstrate those outcomes over time? And I think the first step as well is to be very clear on your hypothesis early, what you want to solve. And then secondly, the how. What are you going to, I think Sarah mentioned for proprietary reasons, you're going to build yourself, you're going to invest in an inch wide, foot deep, because it's proprietary, you need to do it. Second, what are you going to partner on? And I'll share an example in Europe a few years back in the space of heme malignancies. We felt in a public-private partnership model, it would be better for 7 or 8 pharma companies to get together to establish a project harmony with cooperative groups, patient organized on non-competitive data. So we're talking placebo arm data, non-comparative data, natural history. So how you could then leverage that in part of your ongoing label expansion discussions with the EMA and with payers on how do you make sure that your new trials are not then just powered for overall survival, but also what are the inclusion exclusion criteria you need to look at and the complications with stem cell transplant. And we realize as an industry we're vulnerable because we don't have access to that data, but physicians and cooperative groups who beautifully curated this data over time are not going to give it up either. So how do you come to a point of you divide and share and you end up in a space where, you know, that non-proprietary data is more, I would say, applicable and can be leveraged by many others. And I think that's just one example. The other piece, third piece you have to decide is what do you need to acquire and really invest in early outside of your pivotal program. That's going to continue to enable you to establish beyond benefit risk. But I would say, you know, even from a digital perspective, we're talking about, you know, sensors. And we know data is the new currency. And do you wait for you to get a label and then a price in the market and then decide to talk about those topics, or at the very early stage you take some gated risk? And so I think, Eric, it's the hard nut to crack. I think there are opportunities to partner. I think there's opportunities for proprietary reasons to do it yourself. And I think it's an ongoing topic that we're going to continue to have to get a laser-like focus on, I think.
Yeah, and you know, the different kinds of outcomes type gaps, you know, we're still in learning mode. You've got stuff like the 21st Century's Cures Act for the FDA that's beginning to open the door for real world evidence at different levels. You know, there's some discussion outside of that with groups like the FDA and EMA for registries, but there's also when and how should real world evidence, certain methodologies be used. All of that's still kind of in flux. And one thing that, but at least it's moving in a direction. So getting at that journey and not a destination. And, you know, to Shannon's point, learning lessons that there could be some things that are more efficiently collected, you know, through claims versus registry, for example. One of the things, and this has been relevant in, you know, molecular diagnostics over the years, is setting those evidentiary expectations. It's probably to the benefit of the industry to come together and think through and put that straw man up of what good looks like, because back to the sort of mossy rock type of analogy, some of the regulators are busy. The HTA agencies are busy. They're dealing with what's in front of them at the moment instead of thinking forward about under what circumstances, when do you need, you know, a certain level of matching for your indirect treatment comparator, or whatever the issue is, but at least having a straw man for some of these things to help make sure that there's a set of reasonable expectations, and when you can flex, probably would be helpful going forward.
Eric, I was just going to say, we now know, I think it was released about 3 weeks ago, Germany are now mandating this, that this is law, that you will have to collect real world data. In fact, we are a part of that pilot program. And one, you know, from an optimistic lens, that's a huge opportunity because you're going to have 100% enrollment. And that's an amazing space to be in. So you're learning about how your medicines reacting and acting outside of the, controlled clinical trial setting. But on the other side is then, you're at the mercy also of some of the, I would say, stakeholders in the healthcare system who've, as I said, beautifully curated, look after this data. And I think that puts the industry also in a vulnerable state where for sure you need access to your medicines and how they are behaving in the real world. And somebody touched on, do you kind of continue to march on and do it yourself? And I think these are topics, you need neutral brokers between the parties to ensure you don't create more, I would say, tension in the system, but there is space in there for the industry, for the healthcare system, for physicians, for patient groups. And I think, an opportunity for a neutral broker to come in and help that dialogue is important.
Sure. And as we prepare to wrap up, I'll, all three of your organizations have proverbially, landed on the moon, and you've walked around a bit, and you're sitting there looking at the earth. Any sort of parting thought you want to leave, like, hey, for those that will come behind, any out of everything that we've discussed, any sort of thing, hey, if you did any one thing, think about this, whatever it is. Would just like to give you the opportunity to have a parting thought before we wrap our session.
I guess we didn't get into the details of payment models too much, but I would just say I think there's a tremendous opportunity for long-term outcomes-based and/or payment over time models to serve as that bridge and address that uncertainty between the short-term available data at launch and the long-term value these therapies can provide. We need to keep trying to build that bridge, and we need more stakeholders than the manufacturers to help us build that bridge. And I think if we can get there, these therapies will continue to do great things for patients and their families.
Yeah, and right now it's sort of like each manufacturer has their own idea of what they may be able to creatively try to do there, right? Versus what may be the most advantageous, which is having the community come together and operate collectively. Some of the efforts of the ARM Foundation and others are trying to sort of get there, to have that uniform voice to help amplify the discussion around things like new payment models that sort of make sense for the types of technologies we're talking about. So we're in the road, we're en route there, but still some way to go. Sarah, you have any parting thought?
Sure. I need to stop following Shannon because I just agree with everything that she has to say. You have to switch up the order next time, Eric.
Yeah.
I do want to echo what Shannon says, but I also think that Eric, people are getting together and we're trying to attack it from the legislative side and from the regulatory side and working together as an industry. But each company may have their own ideas based on their own disease state, based on their current situation, whether they're part of a larger organization or not. So there's some individualization that has to occur, but the industry as a whole, I think the alternative payment models and the need for change and for everyone to have to make a compromise, that means at the policy level, at the provider level, at the payer level, and at the manufacturer level to try to come to solutions is key. And so we all have responsibilities to try to get these products to patients, and that's going to take this compromise and the understanding that change is needed, and then we could really focus on solutions that will balance all the stakeholders' needs, whether that's alternative payment models, changes to existing price reporting regulations, new outcomes-based models, et cetera.
Yeah, and sorry, I wasn't trying to imply that the industry is not working together. They are. The challenge is really pulling the other stakeholders in and also getting them as enthusiastic on really taking steps to solve some of these fundamental challenges. But thank you. Tay, any parting thoughts?
Yeah, so I'm gonna go back to your analogy, and you were very kind to say we've landed on the moon.
Well, just acknowledging what a feat it is to have the first of these transformative therapies out in the marketplace available to patients. But go ahead.
So no, so certainly building on that, I would say that I think we have a responsibility, certainly for the industry and for patients of Hemophilia, to shoot for the stars and continue to shoot for them. And if we end up continuing to land on the moon, then not a bad outcome. I would also say that it's a huge learn for me as I reset my sort of access brain as well, that this earlier access thinking to make sure that the design of the trials, the endpoints, and really reversing the HTA thinking up front is something we all have to take on as a responsibility and guide our colleagues across the organization and externally. And we know there's a huge vanguard of these therapies coming. And I think the bar will continue to be raised. And I think we will have to keep reinventing our business model in the 21st century to ensure that patients get uptake to these. So in summary, for me, you can't start too early enough, especially in cell and gene therapies. And once you've hopefully ticked some of those earlier boxes, we hope we can continue to bring these to patients across the world.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you guys for being game to participate in this discussion. I really enjoyed it, and I hope everybody out there and our meeting on the Mesa virtual land does as well. And just wanted to also say thanks for your time, and hopefully the next time we all see each other, we can do it in person at Mesa. But as we conclude the panel, just want to say thank you and have a wonderful day.